Right, in the hot seat. It's a discussion. It's not just to grill
more
you.
coffee then.
Okay, I'm happy to present Max Moritz. Max is a statewide fire specialist with UC Cooperative Extension based out of UC Santa Barbara. As an extension specialist, he works to translate science to assist in decision making, and his research interests include understanding drivers and effects of fire patterns at broad scales of space and time. You ready for it?
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, I'm still waking up. Well, thank you, Nicole, for the invitation. Following John is not easy, as you might imagine. Thankfully, I am agreeing with a significant chunk of what he's saying, but there are some nuances that I would like to toss in. Lloyd also got me worried when he saw the title. He's like, oh, you're going to boil all this down to simple management relevant nuggets for us. That's great. Wait. So my hope, after studying this for a while, my hope is to provide in a management context, to provide at least a little bit deeper understanding of where some of the uncertainties are. I hear a lot of really simple statements made about climate change and fire and vegetation impacts, and I think that as end users of the kinds of projections that we're hoping to make useful, it's good to know what went, how the sausage was made, right? And what you still have to worry about, how to be appropriately skeptical. So I think that's one of the things I would like to achieve today, but also show some examples that maybe show some hope for use. So why is this hard? We're talking about the difference between Chaparral and our dry forests, right? We're talking about differences there, between there and there, or there and there, somewhere in there. But with global data like this is just 1 year marching through the monthly fire patterns. We see really rich heterogeneity across the planet, across the different ecosystems. And on one hand, you could just throw up your arms and say, this is too complex, right? These relationships are so variable and possibly changing through time. That was one of the things that John said. Maybe these aren't stable. Maybe they change. But we need to acknowledge that heterogeneity and come up with methods that can capture some of that complexity. Projecting it into the future is even harder. The GCMs, the global climate models that we all rely on for making projections, there's a couple dozen of them. Often you'll hear in the media or you'll hear academics talk about, climate change is going to do this, or a politician, climate change will do that. There's 20 plus global climate models out there that people are using to try to make these projections and analyses, base their analyses on, and they disagree a lot, right? The GCMs, the global climate models themselves disagree. And so here's just an example from a study I was part of. Annual precipitation in the driest month, temperature seasonality, temperature in the wettest month, temperature in the warmest month. For example, if these 5 variables happen to be important for predicting global fire frequencies, you see these model agreement maps, basically. The one that's obvious is all the models agree that temperature in the warmest month is going to be higher. That dark green means high model agreement. But once you get into the something that's a little more nuanced, temperature in the warmest months, temperature seasonality, precipitation is all over the map, literally. There's a lot of disagreement amongst the GCMs on very specific climate variables. And if your modeling hinges on one or more of those, there's a lot of uncertainty in your future projections. So that's something really important to remember. When somebody says climate change is going to do this, what are you talking about? Are you talking about an ensemble of climate models? Are you talking about just a few, one that's been picked for your area? Because it really matters. There's a lot of disagreement amongst them. Then what we've done to different landscapes varies a lot too. Where and how we've built. So if this is kind of the upper half of this is maybe our biophysical system, and this is the coupling, this is our human system. The way we've mucked up different fire regimes, the way we've developed different landscapes, there's a lot of variation there too, right? So this is a complicated problem with high variation and uncertainty in it. Natural fire regimes are complex. There's great differences in how we've impacted these different fire regimes. And then the futures, the GCMs that they provide us, they actually often disagree on really key variables. So California is even harder in a way. On one hand, it's even harder because it is so complex, right? We have different floristic regions coming together. We have the California province, Great Basin, desert, our Chaparral dominated area. You know, we talk about Chaparral as if it's this monolithic thing, Chaparral, but actually there's big gradients right across Chaparral in temperature and precipitation and development. And then the fire patterns across these different landscapes in California are also associatedly complex. So I'm going to give some punchlines right off the bat. Future fire activity is predictable to a certain degree. And the reason I want to just hammer this home a little bit is because I hear both sides of this that I think is kind of overly simplified. There's some people that say you can't predict it, right? It's too complex, or the relationships are all varying. They're all going to change. And I think that's actually not quite true. I think that if you take a broad enough scope, you actually can identify some almost functional forms of relationships between really key kind of quasi-mechanistic variables that are on the biophysical side and on the human side. And as long as you're capturing those carefully, it is somewhat predictable. And then I've heard the other side, you know, it's going to do this. And I think that is also overly simplified. You have to be really careful about simplistic statements on either being too predictable or not predictable enough. As we roll the models forward, we have to have our biophysical variables in there, the climate variables, but you also have to have in the same models, I think this is really important, you have to have in the same models the land development futures. And that's a direction that a couple of groups are now heading. You have to have them both in the models. You can't do one without the other and get any sort of a realistic picture. And I guess I would toss this back a little bit to our manager collaborators. We need to know the time horizon and actually the question that you want answered. I've been in groups where there were fire managers and we've said, look, we've got these projections, you know, 30-year climate norms in there. No, 30. We don't make too many decisions past about 10 years, right? That's kind of, maybe that's a challenge. Like, we need to understand that if that's really true. You know, if we're operating on that short a time scale, we're doing all our modeling at the wrong scale, basically. But we also want to know, hey, if this 30-year time scale is the range at which we feel some confidence, what decisions can we make using that? So I have some examples if we have time for those. I don't want to go through the modeling aside from just the most kind of high-level overview, but one of the ways these statistical models are being approached is similar to how we understand species distributions, basically, right? This kind of reminds you of a niche. There's marginal conditions that are either too hot or arid or too cold and wet for fire, and then there's some really prime conditions on the landscape, and some where variables come together to give you that sweet spot. And actually, from a modeling perspective, habitat suitability or species distribution modeling provides a really nice framework for doing that. And that's something that we've pursued in my group for a while. Again, I don't want to drag you through the modeling details, but we've done it for California and on up to the globe. And some of the really interesting things about doing it at both of those scales is that actually some of the relationships look like they're stable between California and the global scale. Some of those variables actually pop up and they have somewhat similar shapes across those scales, which is encouraging. And here's a look at some of those somewhat functional forms of these curves, right? Fire follows an increasing probability really steeply, going from very low primary productivity, that's what NPP is here, very sharp rise, and then it kind of levels off. And that's actually pretty stable across many, many parts of the planet, California included. And then there's these other variables. I don't want to go into them, but there's fairly fine confidence intervals around some of these during parts of these functional responses, and not so narrow on others. We've produced some global models where we can take the ensemble mean, right? Take 20 GCMs, project fire forward, and you can average them all, but because there's no real average future, right? You can't say the future is going to be an average of that. One of the ways people have approached this from a climate change modeling perspective is what the IPCC does, and they look at model agreement. So if you have 15 or 20 different future projections for fire, how many of them even agree on the sign? Is there going to be more frequent fire or less frequent fire? And that's one of the things that one of the approaches that we've taken with some of our modeling. But again, when it comes to making decisions on management or on climate change adaptation planning, a different angle is being taken, and it's basically which one of these futures should I try to forecast and accommodate? It's not the ensemble mean, but maybe a warm wet versus a warm dry future. So this is looking, sorry, that looks kind of washed out there, but this is looking at all the Mediterranean climate ecosystems of the planet. California's Mediterranean systems occur here. And I'll just draw your attention to the 4 warm dry scenarios versus the 4 warm wet future scenarios. You see the exact opposite across the latitudinal gradient of Mediterranean climates in California. You see the exact opposite depending on whether it's a warm wet future versus a warm dry future. And that tells us something that's really important. We have to plan for one or the other necessarily, because we don't know which one is most likely really. We have to understand what each of these could throw at us. And we have some way of understanding along these kind of functional response curves. If this is a warm wet future, you know, the places that burn more are here in this kind of reddish color. They went from annual productivity or annual precipitation of here, and they rose up to that. The places that went down had the opposite trend. They started high, and they had decreasing fire because they ended up being wetter, more productive, but also wetter. So bringing all that together, as we've modeled at finer and finer scales, we realized you can't leave humans out. It's fine to say climate's going to drive everything, productivity and fire season-wise, and even ignition-wise. But as you get finer and finer scales, you can't leave humans out anymore. So thankfully, John had these same kind of bins. There's something can be fuel limited, so resources to burn, the variables that go into driving that. There's a biophysical set of variables, and then there's the human set of variables that affect the availability of fuel. The fire season, conditions that affect flammability, we have a set of biophysical conditions, and then we have, we have a set of biophysical conditions and then a set of anthropogenic effects, and the same for ignitions. So we realized that at finer and finer scales, you have to put both families of variables into these models. And the reason for that is, this is from a paper a couple of years ago with a postdoc, Mike Mann. The reason for that is when you put the anthropogenic variables and the biophysical variables in the model, you find that the human signal related to land development rivals in importance the biophysical variables, right? That means that you have to have the future climates, but you also have to pick a land use future, right? And then in this particular study, we had business as usual growth, compact growth. Oh, I got it. Compact growth and sprawl. And all 3 of those have very different future fire patterns, right? And here's what we're looking at, the importance of human influence on fire frequencies. The places that are green, the human development is actually driving it down. The places that are red in the future, they're actually driving it up, providing more ignitions versus suppressing fires. And Alex Seifert was one of the first to point out this kind of hump-shaped response of fire frequencies to human development. And there's just some scatter plots of that. Chaparral is down here in our southwestern ecoregion, and that's what we see. We see that kind of hump-shaped response of fire to some metric here that represents human development. So you got to have them both. John was talking about more mechanistic approaches. I totally agree. Thankfully, in statistical models now, we've finally got a few variables that really do seem to mechanistically capture something about productivity of fuels, AET, actual evapotranspiration. and something about the length and the severity of the fire season, right? Climatic water deficit. So we finally have some kind of plant-centric metrics of the biophysical side that are relatively mechanistic, and then getting at a mechanistic understanding of how humans are increasing ignitions and then suppressing fire, and also fragmenting the landscape to the point where it's not as likely to carry large fires. Having all that in the same model is now possible, and it's providing some useful outputs. What don't we know that well? John brought up some of these too. Precipitation is a big unknown in all the future climate models. Whether we're going to have chronically long-term drier systems, precipitation-wise, we don't know, but we're not that far in Chaparral from a desert. We're really climatically pretty close. In terms of interannual variability too, wetter wet years, drier dry years, that's probably going to lead to probably more fire, more opportunities for fire. Winds, yeah, we don't know. So there are some models that use dynamical downscaling, which is a whole breed of modeling to get at future winds, but we really don't know yet. And then this type conversion or grass fire cycle is also, that's a wild card, really. If we have lots and lots of invasive species coming in and bringing fire with them, along with winds and drier years, we may not have a lot of chaparral on our landscapes for that much longer. Okay, so going back to our last thing here, I wanted to show some examples of just how some of these have been useful, and in hopes that collaboration and involvement with managers is realistic and is possible. We want to know what scale. Is it single events that you're interested in? That's a whole different set of issues, or not just why landscapes burn, but why houses burn. Those are actually they're related, but they're quite separate. Or landscapes. Yeah. I think John and I even had this too. It's interesting. And then for me, this is actually one of the keys. What can land use planning do for us in all this? Okay, how to apply this? Before I run out of time. CAL FIRE is actually using some of these fire frequency or fire probability models right now in their greenhouse gas emissions program, where it's a lot of modeling, but somebody can propose a series of fuels treatments, mostly in dry coniferous forests, do a lot of modeling to demonstrate how often, if there was a fire to occur, that particular series of fuels treatments might reduce emissions during that fuels treatment's lifetime. So a lot of modeling. And then they'll use fire probability maps like the ones I just showed you to assess which ones are actually going to do their job more often than others. So they've taken these fire probability maps from a warm wet future and a warm dry future, overlaid them, taken the worst, the most conservative, which you may argue is not the best way to do it, but they'll take the highest fire frequency of the two futures and use that map in assessing which of these projects actually deserves to have greenhouse gas emissions funding. Department of Water Resources has also used these kind of maps. Same thing, overlaid the two futures, taken the worst of the two, and then overlaid their infrastructure, all their canals and dams and reservoirs and pumping stations on these to actually look at their exposure to possible future scenarios to come up with some climate change adaptation planning guidelines to provide them a starting place with how they might proceed with fire. So that's what I wanted to leave you with, and actually leave an invitation to connect with the academics and tell us what you need answered so that we can be answering the questions you need.